The researchers were grateful upon being told that the ruins were finally cleared. They'd been forced to make do studying the carvings of the obelisks repeatedly while the mercenaries cleared the underground city. While they had already been informed of the findings of the mercenaries at the end of each day as they returned to the surface, there were gasps when the story of the bone giant was relayed. Such a creature required not only an abundance of death, but death in the presence of great misery. A creature like that would be easily able to wipe out a group of researchers probing the area. The next few days were slow for the mercenaries. While the researchers had stepped up their pace now that the city was open to them, there was little for Xander and the others to do. He spent his time playing around with runes. He'd managed to make a few discoveries so far. The intelligence rune, interestingly enough, did not actually bolster the intelligence stat of a user. Instead, it seemed to allow simple parameters to be stated and set for the activation of another rune. Xander had already managed to create a motion-activated explosive that would power a flame rune and thus igniting the blasting cap only when movement was detected by the intelligence rune within a certain distance. Similarly, the ranged gathering rune array allowed him to remotely detonate a bomb by powering a flame rune with his own mana at will. The explosion rune, while very space-efficient, simply did not compare to a chemical explosive. However, when used in conjunction with a grenade and an intelligence rune set to allow power to flow into the explosion runes at the same time the flame rune was ignited, did increase the power of his standard grenades. Xander was going to have to be very careful of the collateral these new devices could cause in a fight. Silence was very simple to use. When carved and powered, it created a small area of silence, with an invisible barrier that prevented sound from traversing it in either direction. Carving it around the tip of his shotgun had resulted in an impressively effective silencing effect. No longer did it give off a deafening blast from the tip. Instead, there was only the sharp but muffled crack of the cartridge's primer and the shell being ignited inside the chamber. He quickly repeated the array on his 2 pistols and the .22 rifle. His third rune project combined the intelligence rune, the rune of weightiness, and the movement rune. Using several of the intelligence runes in conjunction with the others, Xander was able to devise a mace that was incredibly effective in the force it could deliver. The intelligence runes were set to allow power to flow into the weightiness runes upon the mace striking something. The movement runes, through a slightly more complicated setup, were also triggered through a strike, though Xander had to create several arrays considering that different ones would have to trigger depending on the direction and angle of the strike. The combination of these runes increased both the momentum and the weight of the mace briefly, as the mana held in the gathering arrays was used. Xander had intentionally overcarved the number of runes for movement and weightiness, so that the mana stored in the arrays was used fully and instantaneously, thus resetting the circuit and allowing the intelligence runes to close the circuit again before the next strike. It would take some time to get used to, but considering the mechanical way in which weapons of war aided his fighting, he felt that a mace would be more conducive versus the finesse of a sword. Creating a few targets consisting of steel sheets, Xander was able to easily create large dents and rents in them. The mace was flanged instead of spiked, as Xander figured that spikes would only get in the way considering the crushing force that was being applied. This thing was an armor breaker and bone crusher, not something that needed spikes to injure. While his gladius from Earth would remain with him as a backup and for nostalgia's sake, this new mace would be his main melee weapon, Xander decided. After a week of waiting, guarding the camp from threats that were no longer existent, the 4 mercenaries were relieved by another caravan, this one containing more researchers and guards than the previous one. The researchers were soon brought up to speed on the situation, and there was a mad scramble amongst them to make their way into the depths of such a well-preserved example of an ancient dwarven city. The guards and workers were left to look after the camp and unload the new wagons. While the wagons and animals would be staying at the camp with the rest of the caravan, 2 horses were given to Xander and Atrax in recognition of the group's help in defeating the goblins and the bone giant. Xander happily accepted the horse, glad not to have to walk all the way back to Klimp. The trip would be long enough as it was. With the entire group mounted and no carts to pull, They should be able to shave the journey down to a week. The journey was uneventful. Xander and Frazee both occasionally supplemented the party's foodstuff with game, Xander using his .22 for small animals, while Frazee bow-hunted, even taking a deer one evening. Xander was regaled with tales around the campfire of contracts that the group had previously taken, and cities they had been visiting. He learned that they planned to head west towards the capital, to the larger city of Anlet, and seek more contracts there. He was happy to follow them and learn more about this kingdom of Dardan that he found himself in. After 8 days of travel, the group once more arrived in Klimp. The city was the same as when Xander had left it, the citizens bustling about their lives and caravans passing through in both directions. They reached the town shortly after midday, and their first stop was the Mercenaries Guild. Atrax was soon regaling several of the workers and other guild members with stories of their fight against the bone giant and their defense against the hordes of goblins. Frazee was perusing the contracts posted on the walls, which left Xander and Graphis to collect payment for the group for the completion of the contract. Dorley, as well as 2 other workers, were currently listening to Atrax's slightly embellished tale of hurling fireballs at a giant monstrosity of bone, leaving Yeselka as the only person behind the counter to help them. The woman looked conspiratorially at Graphis and Xander, asking, "Was there really a bone giant?" "There was," responded Xander enthusiastically. "But it wasn't as big as Atrax is making it out to be," added Graphis. "Still, quite a feather in your hat to be able to say you've defeated a bone giant," commented Yeselka, impressed. "Was there anything else interesting about the ruins?" "Honestly, it was a little depressing," said Xander. "We've written it all down as a report." At this, he manifested a few sheets of paper from his inventory that the group had worked together to write as they had traveled back to Klimp. But the short story is that it was an ancient dwarven city. Just about everyone there died of some kind of plague, and the rest had to flee since they couldn't sustain such a large city on their own. Plus, I guess it was still filled with plague at the time, too. "Wow," said Yeselka. "That is sad. There are so few old dwarven cities left. Too many have fallen to one thing or another." Graphis nodded sadly. I have no doubt that this one would still be a thriving city had it not been wiped out by sickness." Yeselka smiled sadly at the dwarf. "At least a dwarf had a hand in its rediscovery, right? There's that, at least. Speaking of, I assume that you 2 are here to collect your payments for the contract?" "Yes, we are," said Xander. "You can lump it all into one if it's easier for you," said Graphis. "We've added Xander to our little group here, so we'll just divvy it up into 4 equal shares. He's proven himself quite handy to have around." Xander beamed at the praise. "That's so, Xander? Well, I suppose that means you'll be leaving with them soon. We'll miss having our own Godsmarked in town, but that's the way of things, I suppose. Don't forget us out here in Klimp when you're a famous merc taking contracts out of the capital." Xander smiled at the woman. "I won't, don't worry. Klimp has been good to me. Things could have gone so much worse for me when I came to this world, but Thripus and then the rest of you here at the guild and around town helped me along. I don't think I'll ever be able to forget that." "I'm glad to hear you think so highly of us. It's sweet." Yeselka offered her own smile back. "I expect you'd like more than a smile for payment, though," she laughed. "Let me get your payment from the back. We'd already divided it into 4, so I'll hand it out to each of you." She left Xander and Graphis at the counter as she went to collect their payment. Xander waited at the counter while Graphis went to collect Frazee and Atrax to receive their payment. Soon, Yeselka was back, with 4 good-sized pouches full of coin. "Here you are. The client provided some extra coin to be doled out in the advent of extenuating circumstances, and I'd say a bone giant counts for that." Each purse was handed out with a smile, but when Yeselka handed over Xander's pouch, she clasped his hand for a moment. "Be careful out there. Klimp might be a small, slow town, but out closer to the capital, the guild frequently becomes embroiled in politics. I'd hate to hear that something had happened to you." Xander appreciated the concerns. "Thanks," he said, placing the bag of coins within his inventory. "I'll try and keep my eyes open and avoid the politics. Say, do you know if Thripus is around?" Yeselka nodded. He should be at home. I don't recall him taking any contracts this week." "Do you know how I can get there?" "Yeah, he lives over on the western edge of town. He's the third from the watchtower. Thanks. Xander offered another smile to Yaselka. She and Dorley had been beyond helpful towards him. After receiving their payment, the team deliberated on where they should stay. They all felt that a rest of a few days was in order after their week on the road. Xander and Frazé, who turned out to be the other guildie that had been staying at Talon's, both recommended the establishment, and so all four decided to stay there if the inn could house them. Talon's Mark was as lively as it had been the first night Xander had visited. Now that he had 4 friends with him, the place felt much less lonely, too. The 4 of them managed to find a free table. The barmaid, who Xander recognized but whose name he'd never gotten, soon came by to ask what they'd be having. Xander inquired about the wine, feeling like he deserved a drink he might actually enjoy, while the other 3 were happy to stick with beer. When the barmaid came by a second time with their food and drink, and Xander asked if they had space for 4. The barmaid paused for a moment, clearly thinking about the available space in the inn. We don't have 4 rooms, but we do have 4 beds. There's 2 rooms left that have 2 beds each. Frazé and Graphus shared a long look. It's your turn, said Frazé. Ugh, do I have to? Graphus nearly whined. His turn to what? Xander asked. Atrax here. Frazé gave the man a good-natured poke on the shoulder. He looked rather put out by the conversation at hand. Tends to wax philosophical after about 3 beers. Neither of us fancy discussing if we think that the soul is what allows the use of skills or if the soul is merely a byproduct of using skills, so we take turns. Enjoy your freebie because you're up next time we have to share rooms. You two just aren't broad-minded enough to appreciate a good discussion, Atrax grouched. Besides, is nighttime not when you do your best thinking? Nighttime is when I do my best sleeping, Atrax, countered Frazé. Ugh, fine, I bet Xander will appreciate some philosophy. I'll just use a rune of silence if you start keeping me up, said Xander. I'm surrounded by illiterates and troglodytes, lamented Atrax. The group spent the rest of the day lounging, for the most part. It felt good not to have to worry about being out in the wilderness or when the next fight would come. Frazé procured what looked like a novel from deep within her bag and spent the afternoon reading. Xander idly fiddled with his rune work once he had set up a small changing area for the 2 of them to prevent any awkwardness. Frazé had chuckled a bit at his sense of propriety, saying, We've all seen each other's skin out on the road. You'll get used to it the longer you work as merc, I expect. Still, I appreciate the gesture. Xander discovered little new in his afternoon, as he wasn't putting much thought into the process. He did figure out a way to underpower runes and produce a lesser effect, though. A silence rune could be underpowered in such a way that it instead just muffled sound. Xander thought it had potential to be used in combination with an intelligence rune for active noise cancellation, but it was a backburner idea at best, especially since he was now immune to the effects of his own explosions. He'd found that the skill had even covered the damage to his ears from a blast, and no longer had to suffer from as many loud noises. If he ever encountered a creature that could use some kind of sonic attack, it could come in handy, though. Night came, and the 4 mercenaries went to sleep. Xander heard several muffled shouts from Graphus of, Shut up, Atrax, or I'm trying to sleep, damn it. But beyond that, the night was quiet. He'd missed sleeping in a bed more than he realized. It might even be worth the mana to make one when sleeping on the road. The next day came, and the party had little planned. The lack of activity had Xander on edge, as thoughts of home, his wife, everything that he had been taken away from started to slip into the silence. The only way he knew how to cope right now was to keep moving. Leaving his new teammates at the inn, he decided he would visit Thripus to distract himself. The rest of his time he could spend at Smith's, perhaps, and earn himself some coin. Rising from his bed, Xander let Frazé know that he'd be going out. He made his way out of the inn, waving at Briggs, who was behind the counter today. Making his way westward, he soon came to the edge of town, near the watchtower. Third from the end, she said. On one side of the road, the third from the end, was a baker, which left Xander to assume that the small home on the other end must be Thripus's. He hoped he wouldn't be waking the dwarf up, but it wasn't that early. Thripus struck Xander as an early riser from their short time in the forest together. He rapped his knuckles against the door. Give me a minute, came a reply soon after. It's me, Xander. Hi, Thripus. Ah, Xander, I was wondering if you'd come by. Thripus opened his door and gestured for Xander to enter. Come in, come in. I take it your first contract went well? It was eventful, that's for sure. I guess you could say it went well, though, all things considered. Xander spent a few hours with Thripus, recounting his adventure, the fight with the goblins, the exploration of the ancient city, and the battle against the bone giant. Thripus was appropriately enthused at the defeat of the bone giant and laughed with Xander about vomiting after his first real battle. Sounds like you've gotten onto a good team, then, said Thripus. I haven't worked with them personally, but from the few contracts they've taken since they made their way into town, as well as what you've told me about this one, it seems like they're proper professional mercenaries. If that's the case, hold on tight to them. You don't want to end up on a team of glory chasers, or even worse, with a group of thugs that skirt the definition of banditry. The guild does its best to clamp down on those elements, but there are only so many types of people who are drawn to a life of fighting. Thanks for the advice. I like them so far. I'd even go as far as to call them friends, I think. So no worries about me jumping to another team, but I'll keep an eye open if we end up working with other teams. Both you and Yiselka have told me now that the guild can get messy sometimes. It's maybe not so bad as we might have made it sound. For the most part, the guild is a well-oiled machine and an essential part of keeping the land tamed in many kingdoms. But yes, sometimes politics, either external or internal, can get in the way of things. Your team seems like they've got good heads on their shoulders, so I'm sure you can rely on them to help you navigate it if something like that does happen. Their conversation turned to other things. How Xander liked the idea of continuing as a guild member, how Thripus got started as a member himself, some of his more interesting contracts, and how he'd ended up in Klimp. That one was simple. The town had been quiet and pleasant enough, but not so quiet there weren't enough contracts or amenities for him, so he decided to settle down after years of being an itinerant merc. Once the conversation had run its course, Xander said his goodbyes, as well as thanking Thripus once more for treating him so well on his first day in this world. His next stop for the day would be Smith the Smith. Xander! Oh, I was hoping you'd be back for some more rune work. I swear I've had someone in at least once a day asking for more runed items, and I've been all out for a week. The man was ecstatic to see him clearly. Well, I think I can help you out with that again, at least till I head out of town. I've even got a few new runes I can do. Smith looked crestfallen to hear that Xander wouldn't be staying in town to be his personal runesmith, but perked up at the mention of new runes. New runes, you say? What can you do? Well, some of them definitely aren't suited to armor. I doubt anyone wants a rune of explosion on their chest, but I can make pieces that make no noise when they're moving or struck, which I imagine would be great for anyone who hunts or needs to sneak. And I managed an array that increases the weight of a weapon briefly when it hits something, or causes the flame runes to ignite briefly. But that's more work, so it's gonna cost extra. I'm sure you'd also be charging extra for it too, Xander said knowingly. I can see the use of both of those. I'll happily pay double the rate for the strike-activated runes. That kind of thing is popular among mercenaries who either don't want to or can't spare the mana to power an enchantment. And I can't imagine anyone who wouldn't want silent boots in your line of work. Smith was smiling already, and Xander could see the gears turning in his creative processes. Xander also reminded himself that he should silence his own boots. He'd forgotten to do so after the initial discovery of using it to silence his guns. Xander spent the rest of his day at Smith's, as well as much of his downtime over the next 2 days, working away at improving swords, making maces hit harder, strengthening armor, and silencing sets of greaves. He'd gotten much faster and more confident in his rune carving now that he had a few set patterns he could use, and by the end of his time with Smith, he had almost gone through the man's entire stock. If he used a physical coin purse instead of his inventory, he had no doubt it would be bulging. He'd started taking gold for doing multiple items instead of silver for each as he had before. He wasn't sure what he would even need to buy, but knowing he had the money to do so eased the anxiety that the idea of being moneyless brought Xander. His teammates had teased him lightly about being unable to take a break, But the satisfaction of creating things, the payment he got from doing so, and the simple fact that it kept his mind occupied made the activity more than worth the teasing to Xander. They'd stopped teasing him when they'd learned how much he was making a day carving runes, and instead started trying to come up with a business plan to become traveling weapon merchants. Much to their mock dismay, Xander had no particular desire to run his own shop nor become a merchant full-time. The team had had their rest and were ready to get on the road. Xander, Atrax, and Graphus had stabled their horses at the inn, which had had a stable adjacent to it for travelers' animals. Frozay had her ability to call upon an animal to ride. They estimated that at an easy pace, as there was no need to rush, it would take them about a week to reach Anlet. They'd also be passing through a couple of smaller villages on the way. Final preparations were made, mostly purchases of food, and after Xander gave a few goodbyes to Thripus, Smith, Yaselka, and Dorley, they were off. The first day was uneventful to the point of boring. They saw few people or wagons headed east, and the landscape smoothed from the rolling hills of Klimp to flat plainland. The four of them whiled the hours away chatting about any and everything. A few hours before nightfall, they reached a small town with an inn. Fortunately, this inn had 4 rooms open, and no one had to suffer Atrax's philosophy for the night. The second day, they came across another town, this one slightly larger than the previous, but not as large as Klimp. In the center of the town was a large gathering of carts and wagons. Many were painted with fanciful figures of various animals and creatures, often making comically ferocious faces. With the number of villagers surrounding the caravan, it gave off a feeling like that of a traveling circus. As they rode closer, Xander was able to get a better look at the wagons. Many of them featured a wall of bars, and each contained a different animal. Many of them were animals Xander had never seen before. There was a group of what was similar to a small monkey, but covered in iridescent bright green plumage in one cart. Another contained a few wolves, panting and lounging in the small space. Another held a solitary cat, big as a horse and the color of deep, dark smoke. It looked miserable. Xander felt awful for the animals, especially the larger ones, who had no business being confined to any space. He doubted the entirety of a zoo would have even been enough for some of these creatures. On and on, the same scenes were played out. Exotic animals being gawked at by villagers as the caravan merchants called out, "Exotic animals from the farthest of lands, loyal companions, add some color and flavor to your life." Evidently, the animals were for sale, though there seemed little interest from the villagers in actually buying anything. The only area Xander saw a transaction occur was from a cart selling ordinary dogs. Xander turned to his teammates to see what their reactions were. Atrax and Graphus seemed nonplussed, as if they considered the caravan rather tacky, but Frozay looked livid. Xander supposed that made sense, considering the woman was a druid. "Is this kind of thing normal?" asked Xander, hoping to draw Frozay's attempt at killing the merchants with her eyes. "Unfortunately," grated Frozay. "It's not uncommon for the guild to receive contracts to capture an animal instead of to kill," added Atrax. "Since the animals often end up in trains just like this one, we stay away from those. It's just sad." The man shook his head. "There's always a market for animals, whether it's a noble looking to add to their own personal menagerie, or from those with a taming class that are looking to take the easy way out to acquiring a companion. This one is likely headed to the capital to sell to both such people." Graphus explained the reasoning behind carting such animals around in the first place to Xander. "It just feels wrong. I wish there was something I could do about it, but I have no idea what that would be," said Xander. The moment he finished his sentence, he felt a small ping from his status and opened it up. "Quest has been provided with a task, current quest task. Rescue the great Loravian panther. Patron, Hetra, patron goddess of cats. Reward, animal bond." If you love engaging stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay updated with all the latest episodes from FY Stories.